The grand feast started not with music, but with a warning, a whisper sharp as a shard of ice. "Be careful tonight, little mouse." Ilara's voice was a dry rustle like old leaves, and her knuckles were swollen from a lifetime of scrubbing pots. Yet she gently touched Lila's arm, her touch a small warm anchor in a sea of fear. Lila's own hands were trembling, the silver goblets she was polishing feeling like frozen weights against her skin. "Be invisible," she chanted in her head. "Be a shadow. Be nothing." "I will," Lila murmured, her voice barely there. But then Ilara leaned closer, her scent a mix of kitchen herbs and worry. "I mean it. You remember what happened to Anya last year? The Omega from the weaving house?" Lila's blood ran cold. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. Of course she remembered. Everyone remembered. Anya had been pretty, with a laugh like wind chimes, and she'd made the mistake of catching a visiting alpha's eye. She hadn't done anything, not really. But his fated mate, a sour-faced beta from a powerful house, had seen it. What followed was a week of cruel whispers. After that, a public shaming for a crime no one could name. And then, Anya was just gone. Sent away, they said. No one ever came back from being sent away. Deep down, she knew the truth. Being an Omega, especially a poor, branded one like her, was a dangerous thing in a world of predators. He won't even see me," Lila whispered, trying to convince herself. She was talking about the king, King Damon, a wolf of nightmare and legend, a king who had carved his throne from the bones of his rivals. She didn't know what scared her more, the vicious nobles who prowled the halls, or the Alpha King who ruled them all. Ilara gave her a sad, knowing look. "It's not him I worry about, little mouse. It's the wolves who circle his throne." Before she could move, Ilara pressed something small and rough into her hand. A tiny, carved wooden bird. "For luck," she whispered. And then she was gone, swallowed by the steam and chaos of the kitchens. Lila curled her fingers around the bird. It was a pathetic shield against the power gathering in the grand hall, but it was all she had. Her goal tonight was simple. It was the same as every other night: survive. With every heartbeat, the pounding of the ceremonial drums from the hall grew louder, a savage rhythm that vibrated in her bones. She had to go in. She had to serve. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop the trembling in her limbs. She took a deep breath, picked up the heavy silver tray, and walked toward the gilded doors. She walked towards the lion's den.
From the cold isolation of his throne, the grand feast was a tedious performance. The air, thick with the cloying scent of expensive perfumes and roasted meat, did nothing to mask the stench of ambition that clung to his nobles. They were a pack of well-dressed jackals, their smiles sharp and their loyalty as thin as spun glass. He watched them, his golden eyes missing nothing, his face a mask of bored indifference. But then, inside him, his wolf paced, restless, hungry. It had been this way for years. King Damon, the Blood Alpha, ruler of the largest territory on the continent, and he was alone. Utterly. Truth be told, the crown was not a prize, it was a cage. It isolated him because his power demanded it. He could trust no one, not his council, not his guards, and certainly not his high beta, a man whose flattery was as oily as his slicked back hair. "A magnificent feast, your majesty." The high beta, Lord Valerius, murmured beside him now. "A true display of your power and generosity." Damon didn't grace him with a response. His gaze swept the hall. He was supposed to be looking for a queen, an alliance, a political match that would secure his borders. Instead, all he saw were the same simpering, power-hungry faces he saw every day. His wolf didn't want a political match. It wanted its mate, the fated one. A concept that felt more like a cruel myth with each passing year. He had searched for her, his true mate, the other half of his soul. He had traveled every corner of his kingdom, attended countless balls, and sniffed the air in 1,000 towns, but her scent never graced the wind. Maybe it was fate, a curse for the blood he'd spilled to claim his throne. He was beginning to believe he didn't have one. What's worse, the endless waiting was making his wolf more volatile, more difficult to control. My daughter, Seraphina, is looking especially radiant tonight. Wouldn't you agree, my king? Valerius pressed, gesturing toward the dance floor. Damon's eyes flickered to the girl. She was beautiful, he supposed, in a cold, sharp way. But her scent was all wrong, ambitious, and cruel. In that moment, a ripple of cruel laughter cut through the music. It was high-pitched and sharp, like breaking glass. His head snapped toward the sound. It came from Seraphina and her circle of friends. They had cornered someone, a servant. He couldn't see who it was, just a small, trembling figure with her head bowed. But the energy they were projecting, predatory and vicious, grated on his every nerve. It was a sickness in his court, a rot he had allowed to fester for too long because of his own damn loneliness. He felt a low growl begin to build in his chest, a vibration of pure, unadulterated authority. Without thinking, his body tensed, a predator about to intervene. He didn't know why this small act of bullying infuriated him so much tonight, but the injustice of it called to the deepest, most ancient part of his soul.
She had made it. She had delivered the goblets to the side table, her movements so quick and quiet she was little more than a whisper of movement at the edge of the glittering crowd. Relief was a dizzying wave, making her feel lightheaded. She had done it. She had survived the most dangerous part. But then, a wall of silk and disdain blocked her path. Well, look what the kitchen's dragged in, a voice purred. Lila's head snapped up. Lady Seraphina, the High Beta's daughter. Her face was a perfect, beautiful mask of cruelty, and her silver eyes glittered with a familiar, predatory light. She was flanked by two other noblewomen, their expressions identical masks of contempt. I beg your pardon, my lady, Lila stammered, her eyes immediately dropping to the floor. Don't look at them. Don't speak. Disappear. Seraphina laughed, a sound that made Lila's skin crawl. Oh, it speaks. I thought the castle had a rule about vermin in the grand hall. The stench of grease and fear is distracting. Her friends tittered. The sound was a physical blow, and Lila flinched, curling in on herself. Her goal was to just back away slowly, to melt back into the shadows she belonged in. She took a tiny step backward. Please, just let me go. Please. Where do you think you're going, little mouse? Seraphina hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. We're not done with you. The space between them burned with a terrifying energy. With every heartbeat, Lila's panic grew, a wild bird beating its wings against the cage of her ribs. She was trapped. She knew what was coming next. The humiliation was the point. They fed on her fear. In the span of a breath, she saw Anya's face in her mind, broken and empty. Was this how it started? A word? A look? As if fate demanded it, Seraphina's eyes narrowed, a wicked idea blooming within them. She gave a subtle nod to a passing servant, a burly male carrying a large carafe of dark red wine. Before the words left her lips to protest, Seraphina took a delicate step to the side. At the same time, the servant suddenly stumbled as if he'd been violently shoved from behind. He was lurching, directly at her. And in his hands, the carafe of wine tilted, a river of dark red spilling forward, a promise of ruin aimed directly at the High Beta's daughter. Her world tilted. Something inside her shattered. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and she knew her life was over. Time didn't just slow down. It shattered. The world fractured into 1,000 silent, screaming moments, the dark red wine arcing through the air like blood, the collective gasp of the court, a beast sucking in its breath before the kill, and Lady Seraphina's face twisting from shock into a mask of pure, murderous rage. Her shriek ripped through the silence, a sound that promised pain. It promised ruin. It promised an end to the tiny, fragile life Lila had clung to for so long. You worthless filth! In that moment, everything Lila had ever feared came rushing in. The jeers, the whispers, the memory of Anya's vacant eyes. It was all happening. To her. Right now. Her body moved on instinct, a deep, pathetic bow, her forehead nearly scraping the cold marble floor. "My lady, I am so sorry. It was an accident, I swear it." "Accident?" a voice boomed, thick with authority and menace. Lord Valerius, the high beta, shoved his way through the crowd. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes spitting lightning. "Insolence is never an accident. You will be taught a lesson you will never forget." He was moving towards her. His hand was raised, a blur of motion in the corner of her eye. She squeezed her eyes shut, her body coiling tight, bracing for the strike that would break her. A whimper escaped her lips. The sound was small, pathetic. The sound of a dying mouse. Her whole world narrowed to the certainty of pain. She didn't know what scared her more, the blow itself, or the absolute silence from the court as they all watched, waiting for her punishment. But then, it never came. Without warning, a wall of heat and power slammed into place in front of her, a presence so immense, so overwhelming, it sucked the very air from her lungs. The scent of pine and winter frost and something ancient, something wild, flooded her senses. The silence in the hall deepened, but now it was different. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of absolute primal fear. Her breath caught. Slowly, trembling, she opened her eyes, and she looked up, and up, into the golden, blazing eyes of the Alpha King.
The moment the girl was shoved, it happened. A scent. It wasn't like the cloying perfumes of the court or the heavy aroma of food. No, this was different. This was wildflowers blooming in a secret moonlit clearing. It was the scent of summer rain on dry earth. It was the scent he had chased in his dreams for a decade. The scent his soul had been screaming for. Mate. The word was not a thought. It was a brand of fire on his soul. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. The bored king vanished. The restless wolf surged forward, a tidal wave of possession and fury. Everything narrowed to a single point of focus, the small, terrified Omega girl about to be struck by his high beta. His Omega, his mate. He moved. He didn't remember deciding to. He didn't remember rising from his throne. One moment he was caged in royalty, the next he was a blur of shadow and speed, crossing the vast hall in the span of 2 heartbeats. The world seemed to move through thick honey as his instincts took over. He reached her just as Valerius's hand began its descent. Damon's own hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around the high beta's wrist. The crack of bone was a sickeningly loud sound in the dead silent hall. Valerius let out a strangled cry, his face going pale with shock and agony. "You will not touch her," Damon said. His voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. It was the low rumble of an earthquake just before the ground splits open. A wave of his raw, untamed power rolled off him, a physical pressure that forced nobles to their knees and made servants collapse where they stood. He let them feel it. He let them all feel a fraction of the rage that was threatening to tear him apart. Because of that, they understood. This wasn't the king's justice. This was the Alpha's fury. Still, he held Valerius's gaze, letting the man see the promise of death in his eyes. More importantly, he wanted him to understand that his life was now forfeit. But then, a tiny, terrified whimper from behind him cut through his rage. Her sound, his mate's sound. As if pulled by a string, he released the high beta's shattered wrist, letting the man fall to the floor, clutching his arm. He turned, and for the first time, he truly looked at her. She was on the floor, curled into a ball like a frightened fawn. Her dress was torn, her hair a mess, and her scent was pure terror, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever known. His wolf wanted to tear down the castle walls for her. It wanted to slaughter everyone who had ever caused her a moment of pain. Instead, he forced his body to move slowly, He knelt before her, an act that made the entire court gasp. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice softer now, but still thrumming with power. Her eyes, wide and frightened and the color of warm honey, slowly lifted to meet his. The moment their eyes locked, the world outside them ceased to exist.
His eyes, they weren't just gold, they were molten, they were ancient, and they were focused on her with an intensity that burned away everything else. The silent court, the whimpering high beta, Seraphina's hateful glare, it all faded into a distant hum. There was only him, the king, kneeling, for her. Her thoughts spun into a tangled mess. This was wrong. This was impossible. Kings didn't kneel for servants. Alphas didn't shield omegas. The world was tilting on its axis, and she was falling. Before she could move, he reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her chin, lifting her face. His touch was not what she expected. It wasn't harsh or demanding. It was reverent, as if he were touching something impossibly precious. As fire bloomed beneath her skin where he touched, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner. She could smell him now, truly smell him, and it was overwhelming. It was the smell of a storm breaking over a wild forest, of power and safety, and something so deeply familiar it made her bones ache. Her soul answered a call she never knew it had been waiting for. As if the world narrowed to just the space between them, he spoke, and his words were not for the court. They were only for her. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her soul. "Lilila," she stammered, her own voice a trembling leaf in a hurricane. Her name hung in the air between them. He closed his eyes for a moment, savoring it, as if it were the most beautiful word he had ever heard. When he opened them again, the fire in them was brighter, hotter, possessive. Without another word, he rose to his full, terrifying height, pulling her up with him. He kept her tucked against his side, a solid wall of muscle and warmth that shielded her from the world. He turned his gaze back to the stunned, silent court, and then he delivered the final, world-shattering blow. "This Omega," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable power, a king making a decree from which there was no appeal, "is mine."
Mine. The word settled over the court like a shroud, silencing every breath, stopping every heartbeat. He felt the shockwave of it ripple through the room. He saw the disbelief on their faces, the outrage, the dawning horror in Valerius's eyes, and the pure, venomous hatred in his daughter's. Good. Let them see. Let them all understand what had just happened. The fated bond had chosen, and it had chosen her. In that moment, he made a choice too. He was not just an alpha claiming his mate. He was a king setting a precedent. He was drawing a line in the sand of his own court, a line between his past as a lonely, ruthless ruler and his future with her. But he also knew the truth. Deep down, he knew the truth of what he had just done. He had not saved her from danger. He had painted a target on her back, a target for every rival, every schemer, every wolf who saw her as a low-born weakness they could exploit to get to him. Which meant his next goal was simple: get her away, get her to safety. He looked down at Lila. She was trembling against him, her wide, honey-colored eyes staring into nothing, completely lost in a state of shock. A fierce, protective surge, stronger than anything he had ever felt, washed over him. Rather than face the coming storm of questions and political maneuvering, he chose to act. Without warning, he bent down, hooking one arm under her knees and the other around her back, sweeping her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. She let out a tiny, surprised gasp, her hands instinctively flying to his shoulders to steady herself. He ignored the collective gasp from the court. He ignored the furious sputtering of his high beta. His gaze locked on the main doors. "The feast is over," he announced to the room, his voice leaving no room for argument. And with his mate held securely against his chest, her terrified, intoxicating scent filling his senses, King Damon turned his back on his stunned court and walked out of the hall, carrying the impossible girl who had just shattered his world, and remated in the space of a single heartbeat. He was walking into a war on two fronts, one for his kingdom and one for her heart. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he could not afford to lose either.
The world outside the king's arms was a blur of stone corridors and flickering torchlight. Her heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against his chest, the sound a wild drum in her ears. He moved with a speed that was not human, a silent, predatory grace that stole her breath. Every servant, every guard they passed flattened themselves against the walls, their heads bowed, their eyes wide with a fear so profound it was a physical force in the air. And she was the cause of it. Before she could process anything, they were before a set of massive carved oak doors. They swung open without a sound. What followed was a step into another world. Not a servant's world of stone and straw, but a world of impossible softness and wealth. He carried her into a vast chamber, and the scent of old magic, beeswax, and something clean like winter air filled her lungs. Silk tapestries depicting ancient wolf hunts covered the walls. A fire roared in a fireplace large enough to stand in. And the bed. The bed was a mountain of furs and velvet, larger than the entire room she'd called her own. He set her down gently, his feet making no sound on the thick rugs. But the moment his arms left her, a wave of cold terror washed over her. He was so big, so powerful. He was a king, a killer. Her mind screamed at her to run, to hide, to find a corner and disappear. "You are safe here," he said, his voice a low rumble. Safe? The word was a joke. She had never been in more danger in her entire life. Her instincts surged, and she took a stumbling step backward, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. He took a step towards her, and she flinched, hard. A flicker of something, was it pain? Frustration? Crossed his face before his mask of stone slammed back into place. "You are my mate, Lila," he said, and her name on his lips was both a caress and a brand. "No one will harm you. Ever again." He spoke the words like a vow, like a promise etched in fire. But deep down, she knew the truth. He hadn't ended her danger. He had just given it a new, terrifying shape. Without another word, he turned and walked out, the great doors closing behind him with a soft, heavy thud. Moments later, she heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy bolt sliding into place. A lock. The gilded room was no longer a chamber. It was a cage.
He walked away from the door, the heavy bolt sliding home a grim necessity. He could still feel the phantom weight of her in his arms, still smell the intoxicating scent of her fear and confusion on his skin. And his wolf. His wolf was a raging inferno, demanding he go back, that he soothe her, that he claim her, that he never let her out of his sight again. He clenched his fists, forcing it down. For the first time in his life, his own power felt like a curse. Because of that, he knew he was the source of her terror. He had seen it in the way she flinched from him, the way her honey-colored eyes looked at him as if he were a monster about to devour her. Maybe he was. Truth be told, he was clumsy with this. He knew how to command armies, how to intimidate rivals, how to break his enemies. But tenderness, gentleness, these were foreign languages to him. That's why he had to leave. More importantly, he knew that giving her space was the only way she might ever begin to see the man behind the crown. He strode through the corridors, his mind already shifting from the battle for his mate to the battle for his court. He could feel the whispers slithering in his wake. He could sense the shock turning to conspiracy. He had just shattered 1,000 years of tradition, and the wolves who benefited from that tradition would not be silent for long. He found his counsel waiting for him in the strategy chamber, and as he expected, Lord Valerius was there, his arm in a crude sling, his face pale, but his eyes burning with a hateful fire. "Your Majesty," Valerius began, his voice strained, "this display in the Grand Hall, it is an unprecedented breach of protocol. to claim a branded, low-born Omega. Are you questioning my decision, Valerius? Damon cut in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The air in the room grew cold. I am merely advising my king on the political ramifications. Valerius shot back, emboldened by his humiliation. Our allies will see this as a sign of instability. Our enemies will see it as weakness. She is a liability. Damon moved then, a blur of speed that had him standing inches from the high beta. Let me be clear, he snarled, leaning in so only Valerius could hear. You will accept my decision because I am your king. You will show my mate the respect of a queen because your life depends on it. And you will understand that she is not my weakness. He paused, letting the threat sink in. She is the only thing keeping me from burning this entire rotten court to the ground. Am I understood? Valerius swallowed hard, the scent of his fear a sour note in the air. He gave a jerky nod. Damon stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the rest of the silent council. He had won for now, but he knew this was just the first skirmish in a long war. At that moment, his captain of the guard entered. My king, he said with a bow, a request has been made. Lady Seraphina asks for an audience with the Omega. She cites the ancient custom of welcoming. A low growl rose in Damon's throat. A welcome from Seraphina would be like a welcome from a viper. Yet, an idea began to form. He couldn't keep Lila hidden forever. The court had to face her. More importantly, she had to face them. You will allow it, Damon commanded, a cold, calculated light in his eyes. But you will not be seen. I will be watching.
Hours passed in the silent, opulent prison. Servants came and went, their movements silent, their faces carefully blank. They brought trays of food she wouldn't touch, and gowns of silk and velvet she refused to wear. Their deference was a mockery. She could feel their resentment, their disgust in the air. She was a stray dog someone had dragged inside, and they were all waiting for the master to grow tired of his new pet and cast it back out into the dirt. She stayed curled in a chair by the fire, her worn servant's dress her only comfort, her only link to the person she had been just this morning. Was that person gone forever? Then, a royal attendant entered. "My lady," he said, his voice dripping with false respect. "Lady Seraphina is here to see you." Her blood turned to ice. Seraphina, here, in her cage. Before she could refuse, Seraphina swept into the room, a vision in emerald green, her expression a perfect portrait of concerned sympathy. It was the most terrifying thing Lila had ever seen. "Oh, you poor thing," Seraphina cooed, gliding towards her. "You must be so overwhelmed. I simply had to come and see how you were settling in." Lila said nothing. She just watched as Seraphina circled her, her eyes taking in the uneaten food, the rejected gowns, the trembling girl in the servant's dress. My, still in your rags?" Seraphina tisked. "You must understand, there are appearances to maintain now. The king has been very impulsive, but it falls to us in the court to smooth things over, to teach you the proper ways." Her words were honey, but the meaning beneath them was pure acid. "You are not one of us. You will never be one of us." "I don't need any," Lila began, but Seraphina cut her off. "Oh, but you do," she said, her smile tightening. "For example, you should know that the king tires of his toys easily, and when he does, they have a habit of disappearing, especially Omegas who forget their place, Omegas who overreach." The space between them crackled with unspoken violence. This wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Lila finally met her gaze, and for the first time, she didn't look away. She didn't have the words to fight back. Not yet. But she wouldn't give this woman the satisfaction of her tears. She would not break. Not in front of her. The silence stretched, a battle of wills in a gilded cage. Eventually, Seraphina's perfect smile faltered. With a frustrated sigh, she turned to leave. But as she passed Lila's chair, she leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for her. "Enjoy the view from the top, little mouse, because when you fall, I will be the one to step on you." And then she was gone. Lila was left alone, the echo of the threat hanging in the air. She was trembling, yes. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. But beneath the fear, something new was stirring. A single hot tear traced a path down her cheek. But it was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure, simmering rage. The rage was a new and unfamiliar fire in her veins. For years, her only emotions had been fear and a quiet, aching loneliness. But Seraphina's parting threat had burned all that away. And in its place, something hard and sharp had begun to grow. She would not be a mouse. She would not be stepped on. She would not disappear like Anya. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she watched. She waited. She listened to the rhythmic tread of the guards outside her door, their footsteps a constant reminder of her gilded cage. But she had lived in the shadows of this castle her whole life, and shadows had their own doors. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild and frantic drum. But this time, it was not just fear. It was resolve. Moments later, when the moon was high and the castle had fallen into a deep, slumbering silence, she moved. Her bare feet made no sound on the plush carpets. She ignored the opulent main doors and went to a large, ornate tapestry depicting a grim-faced ancestor of the king. She remembered from her cleaning duties years ago, the draft that always seemed to come from this wall. Her fingers, trembling, searched the cold stone behind the heavy fabric, and then she found it. A loose stone. With a grunt of effort, she pulled it free. What followed was a wave of cold, musty air, a service passage, an old, forgotten artery of the castle, used by servants long dead. It was narrow, it was dark, and it was her only hope. Without thinking, she squeezed into the oppressive darkness, her worn dress snagging on the rough stone. The passage was a tight, suffocating throat of dust and shadow. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Every scrape of her feet sounded like a landslide. Every drip of water was a gunshot in the dark. Keep going. Don't stop. Don't think. Eventually, a faint sliver of moonlight guided her to a small grate. Freedom. It led to an empty courtyard on the far side of the palace grounds. She could be gone. She could melt into the night and never look back. But then, as her fingers fumbled with the rusted latch, two large shapes materialized from the shadows of the courtyard below. Guards. Not her guards from the door, but a different patrol. And they were looking right at her. Her breath caught. They hadn't seen her. Not yet. But they were there. Between one breath and the next, she understood. There was no escape. He hadn't just locked her door. He had sealed the entire castle. The cage was bigger than she thought. Her body moved on instinct, pulling back from the grate, melting back into the suffocating darkness of the passage. The rage that had fueled her sputtered and died, leaving behind a cold, heavy lump of despair. She had tried, and she had failed. She was a prisoner, and the king held the only key.
The report came just before dawn. His captain of the guard stood before him, his face impassive. "She made an attempt, Your Majesty, a service passage behind the West Wing tapestry. The courtyard patrol deterred her without engagement. She has returned to her chambers." Damon stared into the fire, his hands clenched into fists behind his back. He said nothing. He had expected this. In fact, a part of him respected her for it. It proved the fire he'd seen in her eyes when she faced Seraphina was real. It proved she was a survivor. But another part of him, a darker, more possessive part, roared with frustration. His wolf did not understand strategy or patience. It only understood that his mate, had tried to flee from him. The urge to go to her, to surround her with his scent, to mark her and show her that there was no running. It was a physical battle. "She is unharmed?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "Yes, my king, she was never in danger." "She is always in danger," he thought, the words a bitter truth. That's why he had placed the extra patrols. He had anticipated her fear, her desperation, but he also knew he couldn't keep her locked away forever. A queen in a cage is just a prisoner. To make things worse, a new complication had just arrived. "Leave me," he commanded the captain. As the door closed, he walked to his desk. On it lay a piece of parchment delivered by a frantic messenger not an hour ago. The seal belonged to Alpha Marcus, the ambitious, snarling wolf who ruled the barren lands to the north. Their rivalry was old and bloody. He unrolled the parchment. The words were a thinly veiled threat full of false pleasantries about territorial rights. But it was the last line that made his blood run cold. "I trust the recent distractions at your court have not pulled your attention from more important matters. A kingdom can be lost for the sake of a pretty Omega pet." The casual, dismissive insult was a blade aimed directly at Lila. Marcus didn't just see her as a weakness. He was advertising it. He was telling Damon and the world that his mate was now a target in their games of war and power. As the truth unraveled before him, a cold, hard plan began to form in his mind. He had tried to give her space. He had tried to shield her. But he was wrong. Shielding her would only get her killed. She didn't need a shield. She needed a crown.
She heard him coming. She didn't know how, but she felt his presence moving through the castle, a storm of power and purpose headed directly for her. When the bolt on her door slid back, she didn't even flinch. She just sat in the chair, wrapped in a fur blanket, watching the door with dead, empty eyes. He entered, and he was not the frustrated captor she expected. His face was grim, his golden eyes burning with an intensity that had nothing to do with her escape attempt. He didn't say a word. Instead, he walked to the table in the center of the room and laid a piece of parchment upon it. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken things. "Read it," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a command. Her heart skipped. Cautiously, she rose and approached the table. Her hands trembled as she picked up the parchment. His scent, pine and winter frost, clung to it, a stark contrast to the ugly, mocking words scrawled across the page. She read it once, then twice. A pretty Omega pet. The words were a slap in the face. This wasn't Seraphina's childish venom. This was a threat of war. And she was the excuse. "He is Alpha Marcus," Damon's voice rumbled from behind her. "He has wanted my lands for years. He has been looking for a weakness, any weakness, to exploit." He took a step closer, and the space between them burned. "And I have just handed him one." As if the world narrowed to just the two of them, she looked up at him, her mind reeling. "Me?" she whispered. I'm his excuse?" "They all see you that way now," he said, and his voice was raw, stripped of all its royal authority. It was the voice of a man, a wolf, laid bare. "They don't see you, Lila. They see a low-born Omega, a distraction, a plaything. They see my weakness." He took another step. He was so close now she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I can keep you locked in this room for the rest of your life, and you will be safe, but you will be a prisoner," he said, his golden eyes boring into hers. "Or, you can help me teach them how wrong they are." In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. This wasn't about her escape. This wasn't about his anger. This was something bigger, something far more terrifying. "They see you as my weakness," he repeated, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "The only way you will truly be safe, the only way we will be safe, is if they learn to see you as their queen." His words hung in the air, a challenge and a terrifying invitation. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath it, the tiny, hot ember of rage she'd felt after Seraphina's visit began to glow once more. A pet? A weakness? A thing to be used and discarded? No. Never again. She lifted her chin, meeting his blazing gaze without flinching. "What do I have to do?"
Her question was not a surrender. It was the drawing of a battle line. A surge of something fierce and proud went through him. This was the woman his soul had chosen, not a timid mouse but a wolf in hiding. He had offered her a choice between a safe cage and a dangerous throne, and she had not even hesitated. "Everything," he answered, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. And so it began. He didn't bring her silks and jewels. He didn't bring her tutors to teach her how to dance or pour tea. Instead, that night he brought her the kingdom. He laid it bare for her on the great oak table in his private study. He brought her military maps, the lines of his borders drawn in stark red ink. He brought her trade ledgers, the columns of numbers representing the lifeblood of their people. He brought her leather-bound books of history and law, their pages filled with the bloody, complicated story of their pack. He started her training not with a sword, but with the truth. "Power isn't in the crown, Lila," he said, his voice low as he unrolled a map of the Northern Territories, Marcus's lands. "It's here, in understanding who your enemies are, what they want, and how to take it from them before they can take it from you." He watched her as he spoke. He expected her to be overwhelmed, perhaps even bored. Instead, she listened with a hungry intensity, her brow furrowed in concentration. She wasn't looking at the maps and ledgers as burdens. She was looking at them as weapons. As the hours bled into one another, something shifted between them. The air, once thick with tension and fear, now hummed with a different kind of energy. The energy of a shared purpose. They were no longer king and captive. They were a commander and his new, most unlikely lieutenant. While her pulse raced with the influx of this new, dangerous world, a different kind of awareness grew in him. He noticed the way a strand of her dark hair fell across her cheek when she leaned over a ledger. He noticed the determined set of her jaw. He was so close to her, their shoulders nearly brushing as they bent over the table, that he could smell the faint, intoxicating scent of wildflowers that was hers alone, even beneath the musty smell of old parchment. As the sky outside began to pale with the first hint of dawn, she looked up from a history of the border wars, her honey-colored eyes tired but alight with a new fire. "What was it like?" she asked, her voice soft in the quiet room. He frowned. "What was what like?" "Before," she clarified, her gaze steady and searching. "Before you were king." The simple, personal question struck him like a physical blow. No one ever asked him that. No one dared. They saw the crown, the power, the monster. They never saw the wolf beneath it. The question was a bridge, a fragile offering across the chasm that separated their two worlds. And for the first time, he felt the ice that had encased his heart for a decade begin to crack. Her question hung in the air between them, a fragile, impossible bridge. Before you were king. No one had ever asked. No one had ever dared to look past the crown, past the blood alpha, past the monster of 100 battles. They only saw the ending. But she was asking about the beginning. The ice around his heart, a fortress he'd spent a decade building, didn't just crack. For a moment, it splintered. He turned away from her, staring into the roaring fireplace because he could not let her see the sudden, raw vulnerability in his eyes. "Before I was king," he began, his voice a low, rough thing he barely recognized. "I was second son, the spare." He told her a short, brutal story, not of glory, but of survival. He spoke of a cruel father who saw strength only in brutality, and of an older brother who embodied that cruelty. "My father believed the bond was a myth, a weakness. He believed power was the only truth. Because of that, he had forced Damon into the trials at a younger age than any wolf in memory. He was meant to fail. He was meant to die. But I didn't," Damon finished, the words tasting like ash. "My brother. He did. He didn't have to say who had killed him. The truth was a ghost that lived in the space between them. He expected her to flinch, to recoil from the killer he had just confessed to being. Instead, when he finally turned back to her, her expression wasn't fear. It was understanding, a deep, sorrowful empathy that struck him with more force than any blade. And in that moment something shifted inside him, a tectonic plate of loneliness and grief groaning under the weight of her gaze. As if pulled by a string, she turned back to the ledgers on the table, her focus a shield for them both against the raw emotion in the room. He watched her, his wolf settling for the first time in ages, soothed not by power or dominance but by her quiet presence. Her brow furrowed, her finger tracing a line of numbers. Then she stopped. "This is wrong," she whispered. His head snapped up. "What?" "The grain shipments to the Ironwood garrison," she said, her voice gaining a new, sharp confidence. "The ledgers show they've received 3 times their usual supply in the last 2 months. But their official legion numbers haven't changed." She looked up at him, her honey-colored eyes alight with a terrifying intelligence. "Where is all that grain going, if not to feed soldiers?" The air thickened. He was beside her in 2 strides, his eyes scanning the numbers she indicated. It was a detail so small, so buried in the mundane records of the castle, that his own quartermasters had missed it. But she hadn't. She, who had lived her life noticing the smallest details because her survival depended on it, had seen it. The grain wasn't for his soldiers. It was being diverted, smuggled. It was supplies for an invading army, Alpha Marcus. "And look," she said, her finger moving to another page. "The authorization for the extra shipments. It's countersigned by Lord Theron. His lands border the northern passes. Not Valerius, not the obvious, snarling enemy, but Theron. Quiet, unassuming, ever-loyal Theron, a knife he never saw coming." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and he saw not a frightened Omega, not a political pawn. He saw the woman who had just saved his kingdom from a blind spot that would have cost him everything. He saw his queen. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw. "Lila," he breathed, his voice rough. Her breath hitched. Her scent, wildflowers and a new, intoxicating hint of courage, flooded his senses. The space between them burned, a fuse lit and racing towards a keg of dynamite. And he let it happen.
His touch was fire. The moment his calloused thumb stroked her cheek, her carefully constructed world of maps and numbers shattered into a million pieces. The air was stolen from her lungs. All she could see were his eyes, molten gold and burning with an emotion so raw, so intense it made her entire body tremble. This was not the king. This was the wolf. This was the man. "You," he murmured, his voice a low, possessive growl that vibrated through her bones. "You are remarkable." Her heart skipped. No one had ever called her anything but Omega. Servant. Filth. The word, from him, was a treasure. A weapon. A promise. Before she could move, before she could even breathe, he was leaning in, and then his lips were on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was a decade of loneliness crashing into a lifetime of fear. It was hungry and desperate and utterly overwhelming. A tidal wave of sensation pulled her under. His scent, his heat, the possessive strength of his arms sliding around her waist, pulling her flush against the hard wall of his chest. It was too much. And it was not enough. A small, broken sound escaped her throat, and she answered him. Her hands, which had been pressed against his chest to ward him off, instead fisted in his tunic, pulling him closer. For the first time in her life, she wasn't surviving. She was living. A wild, terrifying, brilliant flash of it. The bond between them, a thing she hadn't understood, pulsed and flared to life, a supernova in her soul. He deepened the kiss, his growl turning into something that sounded almost like a purr of triumph. He was hers. She was his. In that moment, the truth was that simple, and that terrifying. But then, crack. The sound was like a thunderclap inside the room. Without warning, the massive, ornate tapestry on the wall behind her, the one depicting the grim-faced ancestor, tore free from its iron fastenings. A cloud of dust, and the shriek of tearing fabric filled the air. Damon's reaction was not human. In the span of a breath, he had spun them around, shielding her body with his own as the colossal weight of the tapestry and its heavy iron rod crashed down exactly where she had been standing moments before. The impact shook the entire room. Wood splintered. Stone groaned. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by their ragged breaths. Lila was pressed against him, her face buried in his chest, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. 1 second. If he hadn't moved, she would be dead. She felt a tremor run through him, but it wasn't fear. It was rage. A rage so cold and so absolute, it felt like it was freezing the very air around them. He slowly, deliberately, pushed her behind him, his body a living shield. His golden eyes, now narrowed to predatory slits, scanned the ruined tapestry, the broken rod, the frayed ropes. This was no accident, he snarled, the words a promise of death. Lord Theron wasn't just a traitor, he had just tried to murder the king's mate, and he had just signed his own death warrant.
There was no trial. There was no justice. There was only the swift, brutal vengeance of an alpha whose mate had been threatened. He moved through the castle with the chilling silence of an apex predator. He did not storm or rage. His fury was a cold, black star inside him, consuming all light, all reason, leaving only a singular murderous purpose. Find Theron. End him. He had the guards drag the traitorous lord from his bed. He didn't give him time to dress, didn't give him time to protest. He had him brought not to the dungeons, but to the throne room, the same place where Lila had been humiliated, the same place where he had claimed her. Then he sent for Lila. She came, flanked by his personal guard, her face pale, her eyes wide and haunted. She wore a simple robe, her feet bare on the cold stone. He saw the fear in her, but he also saw a flicker of the same resolve that had faced down Seraphina. She needed to see this. The court needed to see her see this, because this act was not just a punishment, it was a message. Lord Theron was shoved to his knees before the throne. "Damon, you don't understand," he pleaded, his voice thin with terror. "Marcus promised me." "You conspired with my enemy," Damon said, his voice echoing in the vast, silent room, filled now with the hastily assembled, terrified nobles he had summoned. "You funneled my resources to him, and you tried to murder her." He gestured to Lila, who stood near the base of the throne. Every eye in the room turned to her. In that moment, she was no longer an Omega servant. She was the reason for a lord's execution. She was power. "She is the future of this pack," Damon declared, his voice ringing with an authority that was absolute. "She is my fated mate. An attack on her is treason of the highest order. And the price for treason—" He didn't finish the sentence with words. Instead, the change took him. It was not a long, romantic transformation. It was a violent, brutal tearing of flesh and snapping of bone. In the space of 3 heartbeats, the king was gone, and in his place stood a monster, a massive black wolf, its fur bristling, its lips pulled back from teeth like daggers, its golden eyes burning with the cold light of the abyss. A collective scream went through the court. The wolf Damon did not hesitate. Before Theron could even crawl backward, it lunged. There was a single, wet, tearing sound, a gurgle, and then silence. He shifted back just as quickly, his naked human form slick with the traitor's blood. He stood over the body, breathing heavily, his gaze sweeping over the horrified faces of his court. "This is the only warning you will receive," he snarled. He had done it. He had saved her. He had secured his court through the one thing they understood: absolute, terrifying fear. But then, he looked at Lila, and the triumph in his chest turned to ash. She was staring at him, her hand pressed to her mouth, her honey-colored eyes wide with a horror that was not feigned. She wasn't looking at a king who had saved her. She was looking at a monster covered in blood. In saving her life, he knew, with a sudden, soul-crushing certainty that he may have just lost her forever.
The throne room was silent now, save for the frantic, useless scrubbing of servants trying to erase the stain of Lord Theron's life from the marble floor. But Lila knew it would never come out. She would see it forever. She would smell the iron tang of it for the rest of her days. He had sent her back to her chambers, back to the gilded cage. But the fear that gripped her now was different. It wasn't the fear of a mouse in a lion's den. It was the fear of a woman who had willingly curled up to sleep beside the lion, only to watch it tear another creature apart. She had kissed that monster. She had craved him. What did that make her? A soft knock came at the door, and she flinched, pulling the fur blanket tighter around herself. A young noblewoman she'd seen a few times before entered, her face a perfect mask of gentle sympathy. Her name was Kalia. "My lady," Kalia said, her voice a soft, soothing balm. "I am so sorry you had to witness that. The king, he can be very severe. I brought you some calming tea." Lila just shook her head, unable to speak. Kalia didn't press. Instead, she moved about the room, her movements graceful and quiet, lighting a few scented candles. She was a small point of calm in Lila's raging internal storm. "He only did it to protect you, you know," Kalia murmured, as if sharing a secret. "His devotion to you is terrifying. And beautiful. Terrifying. Yes, that was the word." As Kalia turned from the mantelpiece, a small, rolled-up piece of parchment slipped from the sleeve of her gown, falling silently onto the thick rug. "Oh, goodness," she gasped, bending to retrieve it. "Clumsy me. Just some old records I was tasked with archiving." But Lila's eyes were fixed on it. The parchment was old, the seal at the bottom one she didn't recognize. Her instincts, honed by a lifetime of watching and listening, screamed at her. "What is it?" she asked, her voice raspy. Kalia hesitated, a perfect picture of reluctance. "Oh, it's nothing, my lady. Just grim history. From the Unification War, when the king was first securing his throne. You don't need such darkness." But it was too late. As if pulled by a string, Lila stood and walked towards her, her hand outstretched. "Let me see." With a final, theatrical sigh of hesitation, Kalia handed it over. Lila's fingers trembled as she unrolled it. The heading was stark. Final Casualty Tally Asset Seizure. The Cleansing of the Crescent Moon Pack. Her breath caught. Crescent moon. She had a memory, a ghost of a memory, of that symbol being carved above the door of her childhood home. Her eyes scanned the list of names. Wolves, men and women she had never known, their lives reduced to ink on a page. And then she saw it. At the bottom of the list, under the title Pack Alpha, Lord Kalen, her father's name. The room tilted. A roaring sound filled her ears. The date. The date scrawled at the top of the page was the same date that had been burned into her memory since she was a child. The night of the fire, the night she lost everything, the night she became an orphan, the night she became branded. Her eyes lifted from the page, dazed and unseeing, to Kalia's sympathetic face. "Such a brutal campaign," Kalia said, her voice a poisonous whisper of pity. "It was the battle that solidified King Daemon's claim to the throne." And just like that, the final piece of the puzzle of her life slammed into place, shattering everything.
He stood on the highest rampart, the cold night wind whipping at his cloak. The court was silent. The traitors were dead or cowering. For the first time since he'd claimed her, the castle felt secure. He had neutralized the internal threat with a swift, bloody display of power. Now he could focus solely on Alpha Marcus and the war brewing on his border. A grim satisfaction settled in his chest. He had done what needed to be done. He had protected her. But the image of her face, pale and horrified in the torchlight of the throne room, was a ghost he couldn't shake. He had shown her the monster, and she had not looked away. But he knew the chasm between them had widened into a canyon. He had to go to her. He had to try and explain. He had to make her understand that the monster was a tool, a weapon he wielded to keep the woman safe. He turned from the ramparts, his mind set. He would go to her now. He would be patient. He would be gentle. He would spend the rest of his life making her forget the blood he'd spilled tonight, if that's what it took. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way through this. He walked through the silent corridors, his footsteps echoing with a new, determined purpose. He dismissed her guards with a wave of his hand, wanting to face her alone. He pushed open the heavy oak doors. And the fragile hope in his chest turned to ice and shattered. She was standing in the middle of the room, not crying, not screaming. She was eerily still, her face a blank canvas of utter devastation, and in her hand, she was holding a piece of parchment. He recognized the seal instantly, the crescent moon, an old war record he thought had been burned years ago. He didn't have to ask. He didn't have to see the names. He knew. The secret he had buried a decade ago, the sin he had never atoned for, had just risen from its grave. He opened his mouth to speak, to say, "What? I'm sorry? I didn't know." The words were pathetic lies in the face of the truth. She finally looked at him. Her honey-colored eyes, which had looked at him with fear, with desire, with courage, were now utterly empty, as if her soul had been scooped out, leaving nothing behind. "It was you," she whispered, and the sound was the breaking of the world. "All this time, it was you." He felt the bond between them, the fiery, possessive thing that had been a roaring inferno in his soul, suddenly flicker and strain. It felt like a part of his own body was being torn away, a physical, agonizing rip. And in that moment of absolute soul-crushing ruin, a horn blew, a single panicked, piercing blast from the eastern watchtower, then another, and another. Invasion.
The horns of war were a distant, meaningless sound. Her world had already ended. The man she had kissed, the man whose touch had set her on fire, the man who had vowed to protect her, was the monster from her oldest, darkest nightmare. He was the butcher who had slaughtered her family, her pack, her entire world. He hadn't saved her from the ashes. He had been the one to set the fire. The betrayal was a void, so vast and so absolute it consumed everything. Hope, fear, rage, love. It was all gone. There was nothing left. As the castle erupted into chaos around them, the sound of running feet, of shouting men, of steel ringing on steel, he looked at her, his face a mask of agony. His golden eyes were pleading with her, begging her for something she no longer had to give. "Lila," he choked out, taking a step towards her. She took a step back. Her body moved without her permission, a recoil so profound it was a rejection of her very soul. And in his eyes, she saw his choice, her or his kingdom. The agony on his face hardened into the familiar mask of the king. He gave her one last, shattered look, a look that said, "I have lost everything." Then he turned and strode out of the room into the chaos of his war, leaving her utterly, completely alone in the ruins. Without a plan, without a thought, her legs began to move. In the panic and confusion as guards and soldiers stormed through the halls, no one noticed the small, silent Omega slipping through the passages. She wasn't escaping. There was nothing left to escape to. She was simply moving, a ghost in a dying castle. She didn't know how she got there, but eventually she found herself pushing open a set of old, rotted doors, stumbling into a place that smelled of damp earth and forgotten gods. It was a ruin, a circular stone chamber, its roof long since collapsed, leaving it open to the cold night sky. In the center, a crumbling stone altar was covered in weeds and moonlight. The old moon temple. A forbidden place, they'd always said. A place of bad memories. She sank to the ground at the base of the altar, pulling her knees to her chest. The sounds of the battle were a faint, distant echo. Here, in the heart of the ruins, there was only a profound, crushing silence. She had been an orphan, a servant, a king's claimed, a traitor's target, a budding queen. But now, she finally knew what she was. She was nothing. The last forgotten remnant of the Crescent Moon Pack, and the fated mate of the man who had destroyed them. It was a joke played by a cruel, merciless fate. And as the first tear finally traced a cold path down her cheek, she didn't even have the strength to wipe it away. In the heart of the ruins, she was drowning. The silence of the Moon Temple was a living thing pressing in on her, suffocating her with the truth. He killed them. He killed them all. The words were a relentless drumbeat against the inside of her skull. Each beat was a memory lost, a face she could no longer picture, a future that had been stolen from her. She was the last echo of a dead pack, and her fated mate was the monster who held the bloody knife. Her body ached with a grief so profound it felt like her bones were turning to dust. She laid her head against the cold, damp stone of the central altar, the rough surface a welcome pain against her cheek. She wanted to fade away, to become just another shadow in this forgotten place. But then, her fingers, idly tracing the moss-covered stone, found something. A line. A groove. Not natural. As if pulled by a string, she pushed herself up. Her hands moved across the altar, brushing away the dirt and weeds of forgotten years. And she saw them, carvings, faded and worn by 100 seasons. But they were there. It was a story, her story. She saw images of she-wolves with crescent moons on their brows. They weren't cowering. They weren't serving. They were standing beside the alphas, their hands raised not in surrender, but in power. One carving showed a massive, snarling wolf, a beast of pure rage, bowing its head before a calm, serene she-wolf. Beneath it, words were etched in the old tongue, words she somehow knew, as if her bones remembered them. The voice of the moon soothes the rage of the beast. It wasn't a weakness. Her omega nature. It wasn't a curse. It was a key. Her mother, the pack alpha's mate. She hadn't just been a low-born omega he fell for. The carving of the pack priestess looked familiar. So terribly familiar. Something inside her shifted. Her survival, the strange luck that had seen her escape the fire, the reason the king's wolf was so drawn to her, soothed by her presence even when she was terrified. It wasn't an accident. It was an inheritance. The tears stopped. The shaking ceased. The despair, that vast, drowning ocean, receded, leaving behind the hard, sharp bedrock of purpose. She was not the last victim of the Crescent Moon Pack. She was its last weapon. Her thoughts spun, no longer in a panic, but with a new, chilling clarity. She looked up at the moon, a silver sickle in the dark sky. And in the quiet that followed, she found her voice. She knew what she had to do. She had to face the monster. Not as his mate, not as his victim, but as his equal.
War was a familiar hell. The clang of steel, the scent of fear and blood, the roar of wolves ready to kill or die. It was the music he had been raised on. But tonight, it was just noise. Empty sound signifying nothing, because his world had already ended back in that silent, gilded room. He stood in his war tent, his generals droning on about flanking maneuvers and shield walls. He heard them, but he didn't listen. His mind was a wasteland, replaying the look in her eyes. That look of utter, soul-deep betrayal. He had won his kingdom through blood and fire, and he had just lost his entire world with a single, unforgivable truth. What's worse, his wolf, the beast that had always reveled in the promise of battle, was silent. It lay curled in the depths of his soul, whimpering, wounded in a way no blade could ever reach. "Your Majesty?" his general asked, his voice laced with concern. Damon waved a dismissive hand. "Leave me." They fled his presence, sensing the storm cloud of his despair. Alone in the flickering lamplight, he stared at the battle map, at the arrows showing the advance of Marcus's army. He should be feeling rage. He should be feeling the familiar hot surge of bloodlust. Instead, he felt nothing. A vast, hollow emptiness. Truth be told, he was a king leading an army to a battle he no longer cared to win. So, he did something he had not done since he was a boy, before his father had beaten the faith out of him. He walked to the corner of the tent, away from the maps and the weapons, and he knelt. He knelt on the cold earth, a king brought low not by an enemy army, but by a ghost from his past. He closed his eyes. He didn't pray for victory. He didn't pray for glory. He offered up the only thing he had left. "Moon goddess," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. "I ask for nothing for myself. Let me fall. Let my kingdom burn. But her, protect her. Let her find a life away from all of this. Let her be safe. Let her be free." It was a prayer of surrender, an admission that his strength, his crown, his power, it had all failed. In the stillness that followed, he felt no divine answer, only the cold, lonely wind. But as he rose, feeling not stronger, but strangely unburdened, the flap to his tent was thrown open, and she was there.
He stood in the center of the tent, a king clad in black armor, his face a mask of exhausted despair. The chaos of the war camp, shouting men, the ring of hammers on anvils, faded away. There was only him, the monster, the king, the man. And she was not afraid. "Lila," he breathed, her name a prayer and a curse. He took a step towards her, his hands open, a desperate pleading gesture. "Don't," she said, her voice cutting through the air, sharp and clear and utterly devoid of the tremble he was used to. "Don't speak. Not yet." He froze, his golden eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a fragile, dawning hope. She walked towards him, her bare feet silent on the trampled earth, stopping just out of his reach. She met his gaze and she let him see all of it, the pain, the betrayal, and the new, unbreakable thing that had grown in their place. "I will not forgive you," she said, and each word was a carefully placed stone, building a wall between them. "What you did to my family, to my pack, it is a part of you, and it is a part of me. That will never change." She saw him flinch, saw the hope in his eyes die. Good. He needed to understand. "But," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "I will not let that arrogant pig Marcus slaughter what is left of our people just to claim this land. I will not let your history destroy our future." His head snapped up, confusion warring with shock on his face. "I know what I am now," she said, a flicker of ancient power warming her veins. "And I know what I can do." As if fate demanded it, she laid out her terms, her voice ringing with the authority of her ancestors. "I will help you win this war. I will stand with you on that battlefield. But when it is over, things will change. The Omegas will have a voice. They will have protection, by law. They will have a seat on your council. My seat." The tension broke. He stared at her, not as a man looking at his mate, but as a king looking at another sovereign. He saw the power in her, the queen she was born to be. Without hesitation, he gave a single, sharp nod. "Done." "Good," she said, her focus already shifting. "Because your plan to meet his army head-on is stupid. You'll lose half your men." "What do you suggest?" he asked, his voice rough, accepting her lead without question. "I am not a weapon of destruction," she explained, the knowledge settling into her as if she had known it her whole life. "I am a weapon of chaos. My voice, it can soothe the wolf. It can quell the rage that fuels a warrior. It can turn a bloodthirsty army into a confused, panicked mob." She finally met his eyes, her plan laid bare. "Your job is to get me to the heart of their army. My job is to make them forget how to fight."
He rode beside her, the thunder of 10,000 hooves a symphony of impending death. The cold night air was electric with anticipation. But for the first time, The familiar thrill of battle was replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating sense of awe. She rode a black warhorse as if she'd been born in a saddle, her worn servant's dress replaced by simple leather armor, her hair braided back from a face that was set and determined. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was a storm gathering on the horizon. His storm. He had agreed to all of it. Her terms. Her plan. Everything. Because in her, he saw not just the salvation of his kingdom, but the last, desperate chance for the salvation of his own soul. They reached the crest of the final hill. Below them, stretching across the valley floor like a tide of black ink, was the army of Alpha Marcus. Their campfires burned like 1,000 angry red eyes staring back at them. The sound of their war drums was a low, guttural threat. He drew his sword, the familiar weight a small comfort. He turned to her. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low. Lila didn't look at him. She looked at the enemy. She closed her eyes and he saw her take a deep breath. When she opened them again, he swore he could see a faint silver light swirling within their honey-colored depths. "He wanted a weakness," she whispered, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "Let's go show him a queen." As the enemy horns blared their challenge across the valley, he spurred his horse forward, with her right beside him. They were no longer king and captive. They were Alpha and Omega, fury and calm, sword and song, and they were riding into a battle that would either forge a new world or burn the old one to ash. The world devolved into a symphony of screaming steel and snarling fury. He was in his element. The chaos of battle was a familiar cloak, the scent of blood a primal perfume. His sword was an extension of his arm, a blur of silver death in the moonlight. He cut down 2 of Marcus's wolves, then a third, his body moving with the brutal efficiency of a king born to war. But this was different. Every enemy he faced, he saw not as a soldier, but as a threat to her. Lila was a silent, steady presence beside him, her face a mask of impossible calm amidst the carnage. She was his anchor in the storm. Because of that, he fought with a clarity he'd never known. His goal was simple: carve a path, create a vortex of violence around them, and draw the enemy Alpha to him. "Marcus!" he roared, his voice tearing through the din of battle. "Face me, you coward!" As if summoned, a shape of pure, brutish power emerged from the enemy lines. Alpha Marcus was a mountain of a wolf, larger than Damon, his fur a matted, ugly gray, his eyes burning with a rabid red light. "Damon!" Marcus bellowed, his voice like grinding rocks. "I'm going to enjoy cracking your bones and taking that little Omega pet for myself." A snarl ripped from Damon's throat, so savage it was more wolf than man. He spurred his horse forward, meeting Marcus in a cataclysmic clash of steel on steel. The impact sent shudders down his arm. Marcus was stronger, a berserker fueled by pure, unthinking rage. Damon was faster, more skilled, but the sheer force of the other Alpha's blows was staggering. They fought, a whirlwind of violence at the heart of the battle. He took a cut to his arm, another to his leg. He was bleeding. He was slowing down. Marcus, sensing victory, grinned, his teeth stained yellow. "Tired, King?" he grunted, shoving Damon back with a powerful shield bash that nearly unseated him. "Your reign ends tonight." He lunged, his sword a descending arc of death. Damon barely managed to parry, the force of the blow sending his own sword flying from his numb fingers. He was disarmed. He was wounded. He was going to die. And in that moment of chilling certainty, as Marcus raised his sword for the final, killing blow, a sound began.
She felt his pain through the bond, a sharp, stabbing agony that lanced through her own body. She saw his sword fall. She saw Marcus's triumphant, murderous grin. And the time for plans, for strategy, was over. Her world tilted. Her heart, which had been a frantic drum, suddenly grew still. Everything went quiet. The screams of the dying, the clash of steel, the guttural roars of wolves. It all faded into a distant, meaningless hum. There was only the moon above, a silver sickle in the dark sky. And there was the rage below, a toxic red tide that was about to consume the man she could not lose. So, she opened her mouth, and she let it out. It was not a scream. It was not a shout. It was a note. A single, pure silver note that held no words, yet spoke the language of the soul. It was the sound of moonlight on still water, of a mother wolf calling to her pups, of a peace so profound it was a weapon. The note pulsed from her, a wave of impossible calm that washed over the battlefield, and the rage broke. The wolves in Marcus's army, their eyes red with bloodlust only a moment before, suddenly stopped. They looked around, dazed, confused. The fury that had driven them, that had made them a cohesive, killing force, was just gone. One wolf dropped his sword, looking at the blood on his hands as if seeing it for the first time. Another whimpered, turning on his heel and simply walking away from the fight. Alpha Marcus, his sword raised high, froze. The rabid light in his eyes flickered, replaced by a dull confusion. He looked at Damon, not as a hated rival, but as a stranger. What is this?" he stammered, his voice losing all of its bluster. It was the only opening he would get. As if the forest watched, Damon, wounded and bleeding, surged up from the ground. He didn't have his sword. He didn't need it. The monster she had seen in the throne room erupted to the surface. His hands, now tipped with black claws, shot forward. He ripped the sword from Marcus's stunned grasp. And in one, clean, brutal motion, he drove the blade through the other alpha's heart. The silence that followed was absolute. The war was over.
The silence of the aftermath was heavier than the noise of the battle. He stood over Marcus's body, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, his blood dripping onto the dead earth. Marcus's army, broken and leaderless, was throwing down their weapons, surrendering in droves. But he didn't see them. He only saw her. She was still on her horse, her face pale, her body swaying with an exhaustion so profound it terrified him. He stumbled towards her, his wounded leg threatening to give out. "Lila," he breathed, his voice raw. She slid from the horse, her legs collapsing under her. He caught her just before she hit the ground, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her into his embrace. She felt so fragile, so small. He had nearly gotten her killed. "I'm all right," she whispered against his chest, her voice faint but firm. Moments later, his men brought the prisoners forward, and among them, her face a mask of spitting, venomous fury, was Lady Seraphina. She had been captured trying to flee with the enemy. "You!" Seraphina shrieked, her eyes locking on Lila. "This is your fault! You mongrel filth! You ruined everything!" Before he could give the order for her execution, Lila gently pushed away from him. She stood on her own, her shoulders straight, her face calm. She looked at the snarling, hate-filled noblewoman who had tried to destroy her. The old Lila would have cowered. The old Lila would have hidden behind him. But the old Lila was gone. "You speak of bloodlines and worth," Lila said, her voice quiet, but carrying across the stunned silence of the battlefield. "Yet you betrayed your pack. You sided with our enemies. You have no honor. You have no worth." She looked at Damon then, a silent question and a firm command in her eyes. "Execution is a warrior's death. She doesn't deserve it." She turned back to Seraphina. "You are stripped of your name and your rank. You are banished. You will leave these lands by sunrise and never return. If you are ever seen here again, you will be hunted down like the traitorous stray you are." It was a judgment more humiliating and more fitting than a quick death. It was the judgment of a queen. He watched, his heart swelling with a fierce, painful pride. And as Seraphina was dragged away, still screaming her impotent rage, he knew what he had to do. He stepped forward, taking Lila's hand in his, and addressed his victorious army. "You see before you," he declared, his voice ringing with an authority that was absolute. "Lila of the Crescent Moon, your queen. Her word is my word. Her command is my command. This is the new order." But as the army roared its approval, a new battle began. The war for his kingdom was over. The war for her heart had just reached its final, desperate stage.
He took her back to the one place that felt both like a wound and a sanctuary, the Moon Temple. The sky was beginning to pale with the first light of dawn. The air was cold and clean, washing away the stench of the battlefield. They stood in the center of the ruins before the crumbling altar where she had discovered the truth of her bloodline, and the silence between them was the loudest thing she had ever heard. He finally turned to her. His armor was gone, replaced by a simple tunic. His wounds had been cleaned and bound, but the wound in his soul was wide open for her to see. The king was gone. The monster was gone. There was only Damon. "My father was a cruel man," he began, his voice low and rough, not making an excuse, just stating a fact. "He taught me that love was a lie and power was the only god worth worshipping. When I learned of the Crescent Moon Pack's alliance with a rival, I didn't see people. I didn't see families. I saw an obstacle, a piece on a board." He looked at her then, his golden eyes raw with a grief that mirrored her own. "I led the attack. I gave the orders. And when I learned there was a single survivor, a child, I ordered the records burned and the memory of your pack erased. Because a survivor was a loose end. A weakness." His voice broke. "I spent 10 years becoming a king, only to find out that the one thing my soul needed to be whole was the very person my ambition had tried to destroy." Her chest ached. The truth was a blade, and he was turning it in both of their hearts. "I will not ask for your forgiveness, Lila," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It is not mine to have. What I did is unforgivable." He took a small, hesitant step back, creating a space between them. "The bond, it is a chain for you, a tie to the monster who slaughtered your family. So I will offer you the only thing I have left to give, the only thing you truly deserve." He looked her straight in the eye, and she saw the terrifying, beautiful truth of his sacrifice. "Your freedom. I will sever the bond. I will give you gold, guards, whatever you need. You can go anywhere, build a new life, and be free of me forever. You will never have to see me again." The air stilled. Her thoughts spun. He was offering her an escape. He was offering her the one thing she thought she wanted. She could walk away. She could leave the ghosts behind. She could be free. But as she looked at him, this broken, beautiful, terrible man who had destroyed her past and then laid his entire future at her feet, she finally understood. "You were a monster," she whispered, and she saw him flinch, accepting the brand. "You did unforgivable things, and that will always be a part of our story." She took a step towards him, closing the space he had created. "But you are not that wolf anymore," she continued, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I have seen the king who knelt for a servant. I have seen the man who was willing to lose his kingdom for my safety. I have seen the wolf who was willing to sever his own soul to give me peace." She reached up, her trembling hand touching his cheek. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a dying man drinking his first drop of water. "My past was stolen from me," she said, a single hot tear finally falling. "I will not let it steal my future too." And as the first rays of the rising sun broke over the horizon, painting the ruins in gold, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was not a kiss of fire and desperation. It was a kiss of forgiveness, a kiss of choice, a kiss that didn't erase the scars, but promised to build a new world around them. In the quiet that followed, a month later, they stood before the entire pack. He, the Alpha King, in black and silver, and she, the Moon Queen, beside him, not behind him. As they were crowned together, under the light of a full moon, she knew the truth. Their love story wasn't a fairy tale. It was a legend, born from ashes and built on the terrifying, beautiful, and unbreakable strength of a monster who had learned to kneel.